I will be quick, but it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. I'm Victoria Rosner. I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs at Columbia's School of General Studies, and I'm glad to have us all here together for what looks to be a very stimulating day. Before I turn things over to the participants in our first panel, I just want to sketch out what I see as an important context for today's event, which is the growing partnership between Trinity College Dublin and Columbia University. The partnership between Trinity and Columbia began around 2016 with the decision to form an undergraduate dual degree program. In this program, the two institutions effectively agree to share a group of undergraduates who attend each school for 2 years and graduate in 4 years with 2 undergraduate degrees. As you can imagine, or as you might imagine, the program attracts students who are interested in a truly global undergraduate experience and who have unusual ambition and spirit, I think it's fair to say. We have 4 pilot students from Trinity at Columbia this year, and a cohort of over 40 students in the full program have just begun their first year of study at Trinity this year. These 40 students come from about 11 different countries. We expect that the international component of the program is only going to grow. In this, which is our first real recruitment cycle for the program, we have already held information sessions for it in Mumbai, Beijing, and Amman, as well as in Dublin and New York. But global university partnerships do not realize their full potential, I think, if they focus exclusively on student experience. In developing the partnership between Trinity and Columbia, it's been exciting to see faculty collaboration take shape alongside the dual BA. From the outset, our faculty programs and events have been closely tied to current events, taking advantage of the comparative US-EU vantage points to generate dialogue. Our first joint event, we were talking about it last night, held in December 2016 at Columbia, was a 2-day conference titled Brexit, Before and Beyond.
Beyond.
Now it's funny. I think I came up with that title. Okay. That wasn't even meant to be a laugh one. That's so sad. Okay. That focused on the underlying issues leading up to the Brexit vote, as well as the continuing fallout, continuing being the operative word, and its particular impact on global universities. Then came the 2016 US election, so our next event, which was held at the Trinity Long Room Hub, was Trump's America, 60 days in. All that seems like a really long time ago, actually, but it is amazing to me how the growth of this partnership has really tracked world events. Many other events have followed, too many to enumerate here, together with an MOU between the Trinity Long Room Hub and Columbia's Heyman Center for the Humanities. These events have coalesced around the broad theme of crisis of democracy, a theme that seems likely to remain relevant for the foreseeable future. Today's event will be followed by another in May at Columbia's Paris campus, Reed Hall. This summer will bring the CHCI Mellon Global Humanities Institute 2019, Crises of Democracy Through the Prism of Cultural Trauma, which will be held this summer in Dubrovnik. It's possible, or I like to think, of these events as one long conversation, playing out over years and in response to world events, a global response to global challenges. Credit for all of this goes to Jane Ohlmeyer at the Long Room Hub and Columbia's Eileen Galuli, who have created a wonderful infrastructure for faculty collaboration. For today's event, in addition to those people, I also really want to thank Emily Bloom, who can't join us today, and the Harriman Institute for their support of today's event. Last night, we kicked off the conference with Dan Hoyle's performance of Border People, a work which threw into relief the damage caused by aggressive and uncollaborative relations between nations and the human cost of that. Without getting too lofty about it, and just for a second, I'd like to offer that global universities can help to model a different approach to international relations, one organized around shared interests advancement of human knowledge and well-being, and the value of diversity and comparative perspectives, events. And I think all of these themes are embodied in events like this one. Last night in the talkback, Dan described the human stories he tells in Border People as an antidote to contemporary politics, and important work to do right now. I couldn't agree more. He said in the talkback that he felt super lucky to be doing this work, and I feel super lucky to be welcoming you all to today's wonderful program. Now I'll turn things over to Maria Gonzalez-Pendas, who will introduce our first panel. Thank you.
For a setup, the stakes are not at all high. We hope that the laughs that the title of these conferences will produce in 2 years will be of the right kind. But we'll see. Welcome to the first panel of a very exciting day and lineup of the speakers. The populist appeal of the strongman. This is what brings us now together in this first panel. I want to give the audience some of the ideas that you have been sharing in preparation for this panel, the ideas that Victoria and Emily and others put together in putting the panel together just to set up the conversation. This is truly a conversation. How the panel is going to work out. Each of our speakers could talk for many hours about this topic, but we're only giving them 8 to 10 minutes to present some of the ideas. We're going to do sort of back-to-back conversation to then open up to connections, conversations amongst yourselves, and of course also with the floor. And we're beginning today heading right to the chase and talk about the cultural and political construction of the strongmen and their role in provoking democratic crisis. They do so pervasively, in fascinating manners, and often from within democracy itself. Our presenters will lay out a broad historical and global landscape of these figures or of the processes of their coming into being, with an emphasis on the relationship between the representation, techniques of representation of the modern leader and the actions that they advocate, that they implement, or that they help rationalize at a collective level, if often by means of irrational social values and ideals. The ideas that anchor this panel pertain the techniques through which these strongmen have construed their image value, again this idea of representation being crucial today, and the tensions that they have embodied between collective and individual, and again between rational and irrational discursive structures. How are we, for instance, to interpret Putin's umbrella scene during the World Cup's final, and Trump's praise of Putin during his first cabinet meeting as rituals of power? And how do we monumental building projects, such as Viktor Orbán's, you can see here, image, Viktor Orbán's stadium building in Hungary, or Erdogan's monumental presidential palace, or his emphasis on infrastructural constructions, I'm thinking on his airport, for instance. What do these projects tell us about the nature of their regimes? These are dynamics that have both escaped the public in their ubiquity, but also their promises of progress, and have also captivated the public through their aesthetic allure. These myths, rituals, and images that construe the strong leader have long worked rather successfully for the strongmen, at least. And thus, as our presenters will make all too clear, it is in the processes of political and imaginary construction of these figures where the signals of democratic crisis perhaps lie best, indicating the emergence of authoritarian practice in the very midst of democratic environments. So basically they're going to teach us how to be more aware of the signals. In order of speakers, first we will hear from Balázs Apor. He is a historian of Central and Eastern European in the 20th century with a special focus on the communist period. He is a professor in the European Studies in the Center for European Studies and the Department of Russian and Slavonic. Slavonic or Slavic? Slavonic. What do I know? Slavonic Studies at Trinity College, and also the director of the European Studies MPhil program at the School of Literature, Languages and Cultural Studies. I decided not to list the many, many publications that are in this table just for the virtue of time. Afterwards, I believe we hear from Ruth Ben-Ghiat, known to this house. She is a professor of Italian and history at New York University and a cultural critic, very active cultural critic and public voice as of late. She's the recipient of Guggenheim, Fulbright, and other fellowships, and an expert on fascism, authoritarianism, war, propaganda, mainly in the context of Italian fascism, but also an expert on Donald Trump. So it says here that she writes frequently, not only scholarly work, but also for the media on these topics, and has provided podcasts and political commentary for venues such as Sky News, KCRW, Democracy Now!, Al Jazeera, and other venues. We will hear afterwards from Guido de Haan, a professor of political history at Utrecht University, and the 2019 Queen Wilhelmina Visiting Professor of the History, Language, and Literature of the Dutch-speaking people at Columbia University. His fields of interest are the political history and philosophy of democracy and of the welfare state in Western Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, the history and memory of the Holocaust and other large-scale violence, as well as regime changes and political transitions since the early modern period. Finally, we will hear from Valentina Izmirileva, professor of Slavic languages at Columbia University. She is a scholar of Balkan and Russian religious cultures with a strong background in critical theory and intellectual history. Some of her areas of specialization include the scope of her teaching and interest, the religious culture of the Orthodox Slavs, with an emphasis on the medieval and early modern periods, and literary modernism and postmodernism, with a focus on Vladimir Nabokov. Her research very interestingly intersects cultural transfers among Christians, Jews, and Muslims in the context of multi-religious empires. And it just hit me that I haven't set the titles of your presentations. Do you want to start with them as you present your papers? Okay, so let's applaud to introduce the papers. So I'll say the title. So Balas will start with Strongman Body. No. Oh my goodness. The Return of the King. No, let me please. The Return of the King, the Crisis of Democracy, and the Rebirth of the Leader.
Perfect. Thanks, Mary. Thanks for the very kind introduction as well. It is a great pleasure to be here as always, and of course it's a great pleasure to talk about the topic that I've been working on, and this is of course strongmen and the danger they pose to democracy. As the description of the panel indicates, I will be focusing more on representation and the representations of strongmen rather than on their politics, arguing, as the panel description argues as well, that there is an inherent link between representations and political action, and that we could learn an awful lot about how these people are represented or represent themselves, and could make relatively accurate assumptions about the kind and the trajectory of leadership that they would represent once in power. So representations are crucial, partly because of the notion of the strongman itself. The strongman, as Arthur Brown has very nicely elaborated in a monumental book, is mostly a myth. Leaders claiming to be strong are most often not as strong as they would like us to believe, and strength often comes from representations rather than actions. And one should also add that when leaders, or of course lead dictators, are acting strong, they most often cause chaos rather than bring about consolidation, and they often contribute to the escalation of crisis, but it's a slightly different topic. Now, first of all, I'd like to apologize for the title. I don't make cheap Lord of the Rings references at all, but there was an actual image that served as an inspiration behind this title, and the image is what you can see on the slide there, which is a wooden carving that shows Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. This carving was spotted at a village fair last autumn, and of course in the age of social media it went instantly viral, and of course provoking all sorts of responses. Some considered it as appallingly sycophantic, Others, of course, responded positively. For example, people have produced this meme which says that we are not afraid, we are not cold, Viktor Orbán is our king. This was published at a Facebook fan page for Viktor Orbán. I'll go back to this image before. So, of course, you could consider such images as isolated examples of absurd Baltic adulation, and indeed it is highly unlikely that it was sanctioned by the government. But I think it does signal the return of certain practices, which is the irrational veneration of political leaders that we hope were long forgotten. There is, of course, the absurd fusion of monarchical symbols, folk art, and of course iconographic representation of leaders, and this suggests that long-term legacies of the past, which include the legacies of communism, the legacies of inter-war authoritarian regimes, and of course monarchical or imperial legacies indeed, are still at work in Hungarian political culture today. Now, of course, the world has seen the return of the strongmen, and I think this panel gives a very good overview of individual cases, so I won't talk about that. I mean, there are various themes that I suppose would connect all our presentations, and that is the themes or the images that some of the representation of these leaders evoke, and that's of course stability and order, and the claim to restore order and represent order in times of crisis and social upheaval. Now, of course, the return of the strongmen also provoked the return of cultic representations, and these leaders are increasingly represented in cultic terms and with the help of a vocabulary that appeals to emotions rather than reason. And some of these leaders, most famously, of course, Vladimir Putin in Russia, are by now surrounded by what I would call a fully blown leader cult. What do I mean by leader cult? It's also in the titles, and I think I need to explain that briefly. By leader cult, I mean a system of myths, which includes textual representations and visual representations, as well as rituals, which of course mostly includes social practices with symbolic content, which, when combined, promote irrational representations of a leader that serves a specific political function. So I would argue that cultic representations of a leader are part of a method of rule. So they are not just absurd side products of authoritarian regimes or authoritarian patterns of rule, but they are inherently part of the exercise of power and the way these people rule. Now, where does the crisis of democracy come in? Of course, it is needless to say, and I suppose most of us would agree on this, that populist and authoritarian leaders thrive on chaos and crisis. So crisis situations, may they be political, moral, or economic, bring such leaders to the forefront. What I would argue, however, that representations or cultic representations often predate actual crisis situations, and when cults are constructed, that actually happens after crisis situations, so in times of the consolidation of power, not necessarily economic consolidation, but the consolidation of power when opposition is ruled out. Mostly because cult building requires resources, it requires money and manpower, and this is why you need kind of more consolidated times to actually be able to construct real cults. But cultic representations, of course, predate times of crisis as well. And my example for those kind of very simple and basic points, again trying to meet the 10-minute challenge here, would be of course the emerging cult and the dissemination of cultic representations of Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. He has now become a kind of major point of reference, and not just in Europe but also across the world, which is a bit sad for me coming from Hungary, but this is the case. But anyway, so I don't have, of course, time to discuss his political trajectory and his career, but what I'd like to emphasize here is that when he was in power as Prime Minister between 1998 and 2002, but nothing changes, and some people argue that he was already surrounded by cultic representations at the time. What I would argue is that the crucial period was when he was in opposition between 2002 and 2010, and it's the lack of representations of Orbán that I find crucial. He was strategically removed from day-to-day political punch-ups with the specific aim of preserving his reputation. I think the party understood that he is essentially the primary symbolic asset that the party had at the time, so it was deliberately removed from day-to-day political struggles. Now, of course, after the electoral victory and after the moral crisis of 2006 and the economic crisis of 2008, it was more and more foregrounded, and of course with the electoral victory of 2010, his figure started to dominate the communication strategy of the governing party, Fidesz. Now, what are the images that are evoked in relation to his persona? Of course, crisis is a central component in the growth of his cultic representations, and it remains the key theme in government propaganda as well. It is kind of codified in the Constitution, which is really weird if you think of it, because the entire period between 1989 and 2010 is considered as the years of what's the exact phrase, is the turbulent years of post-communist transition, which is essentially the codification of crisis, which is, I think, is remarkable. But also, if you look at his political speeches, and some people even quantified that recently, themes of fear, anxiety, threat are amongst the most common themes. In fact, they are amongst the most common words that are used in his speeches. So he is indeed thriving on chaos, and his image is essentially grows out of the themes of fear and threat. Of course, I'm getting there. So, of course, it was the refugee crisis of 2015 when crisis and the notion of the nation on the threat became cemented to his persona, and this is still the central trope of his representations, despite the fact that, for example, last August there were only 13 illegal border crossings in Hungary. Nonetheless, the state of emergency was extended, and I think in the same month, actually. So this means, again, that representations matter more than actual problems, and this is just to underline my point. Now, other representations, of course, include Orbán as the competent manager, a responsible, decisive and a caring leader, the man in charge, of course, in times of great crisis like floods or extreme weather conditions, heavy snowfall, and so on and so on. But there is also a revival of the notion of the leader as the father of the community, the father of the nation, which is represented or manifests itself when he is represented in the company of children, kindergarten children during the 2018 election campaign, for example. But also in Facebook memes, such as this one. This Facebook page, this fan page for Viktor Orbán, constantly calls him daddy, which is actually quite... I mean, I've been working on leader codes for a long time, but daddy is something that I can't digest yet. It's father, but daddy is something that's totally unique and new to me. Anyway, but he's also, so the father image, of course, is constantly evoked as well. But he's also portrayed as an exceptional statesman, which is a traditional image linked to the strongman, a man who defends Europe from itself. That has become a recurrent theme, but also a man who brings together the Visegrad 4 countries. But at the same time, he's also represented as a man of the people, visiting random old ladies in random villages, going to kindergartens, talking to ordinary people. There's this fantastic video when he talks to a drunken trashman, or indeed talking to Chuck Norris, who visited him again about a year ago. There's a fantastic video about that as well, if you're interested. I have it on me. And I would argue that this theme, I'm wrapping up now, is the theme of the leader as a man of the people, is in fact an aspect of post-communist legacy, and this is a theme that is essentially the hangover of the representation of Communist Party leaders as well. And just to wrap up really quickly, I would argue that the case of Viktor Orbán shows the interaction of multiple historical legacies at play that resulted in the re-emergence of a well-known phenomenon but in a somewhat hybrid form. And I would also highlight again and emphasize again that the trajectory of his emerging cult is closely aligned with the cumulative radicalization of his policies and are indicative of the path that he will take, which again underlines or underscores the organic link between representations and political action. And I would leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Was it 10 minutes?
Kind of the concept. So Ruth Benguier will now present the Strongmen body policy.
Yeah, you pass it on. Yeah.
Yes.
No, I just forgot this image there. It's Orbán saving the Hungarians in the form of a Superman.
Oh dear.
We can talk about that during the Q&A if you're interested.
Can you hear well in the back? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me here. Get right to it. So this is part of from a book on strongmen that I'm writing. Yes. Okay. That's better. Over here. So it's escaped no one that we're living through a historic period. This is the third big time of popularity of charismatic male leaders after fascism and the decolonization/Cold War periods. And the new authoritarians obviously build on the old ones as part of my project. I look just very briefly at how the strongman uses his body as a vehicle of seduction and threat. I had a whole thing about Crises, which I eliminated for time, but Balázs has said it for me, which is the great thing about this interrelations of research on this panel. So for 100 years, the strongman has been said to emanate charisma. But it's a very particular kind of charisma. It's not the charisma just where somebody attracts people to them like a film star. This is a kind of, that's a benign, we might say, charisma. This is a malignant charisma, a strongman charisma. It's a charisma that is said to exert a hold over people and get them to do their bidding. He gets them to do his bidding. Now, although Max Weber, from Max Weber forward, all of the theory in charisma has said that it is a relation and not a thing, and that it is useless if the strongman's followers do not recognize it as such and decide to invest in him. This charisma, this form of charisma has had its own charisma. It bolsters patriarchy and male force, and it conceals the dependence of the strongman on his followers. It conceals his insecurity and fear, and the way he has worked very hard at his charismatic powers. And in fact, most successful strongmen come to politics with some experience in the arts of mass communication or dissimulation. Mussolini and Mobutu were professional journalists. Hitler took voice and hypnotism lessons. And as is well known, his photographer Hoffman photographed him at his request, practicing his gestures that mimicked, very deep primal emotions. Berlusconi and Trump were experienced marketers. So here is Trump advertising his steaks. And what's very interesting is, he, as we know all about his history, but during one of his first press conferences, because I covered the campaign for CNN Opinion, I didn't go to them, but I had to write about everything. And at the very first press conference, he had a big display of Trump steaks, Trump water, and Trump wine because he was transitioning into politics, and what he had was his marketing, his brand. And of course, we have Putin, which Valentina is going to talk about, and his branded scent, Leaders One. And Putin grew up with Soviet propaganda, as we know, and he honed his skills at mirroring and deception, doing intelligence work. And Pinochet, although he only learned about the coup 3 days before it happened, he quickly, he drew on his military background. He understood the optics of power and pageantry very well. This was one of the first photo ops just a week after the coup, and he was asked to remove his glasses by the Dutch photographer, and he said simply, "Yo soy Pinochet." I am Pinochet, I'm not removing my glasses. So one of the points I want to make here quickly is that the strongman does not just represent the nation as regular leaders do. He is actually, through his body surface, and his performances, the bearer of the nation's wounds and the bearer of its humiliations. In 2019, as in 1919, he poses as someone bravely defying the biased media to speak the truth. He risks everything to free his people from leftist tyranny and foreign humiliation and exploitation. This is a Weimar era image of Hitler, who is, muzzled by hate speech bans. He had bans on his speech, and it was when they were taken off, and in one case they were regional bans, local bans. He promised that he would work for democracy, and that's how he got one of them removed. So it's important that he expresses for people, for the people, what they cannot express. I am your voice, someone who's in power now said. And they feel the pain and anxiety, they feel it for the people. This is how they represent themselves. And they alone can heal because they alone can feel. So this applies also to anti-colonial strongmen. It kind of passes, it applies to imperial strongmen, but also anti-colonial. And Gaddafi, his costuming is often dismissed as, he's crazy, he's the mad dog, he's eccentric. But it's very, very important, his costuming, because he is the bearer and vindicator. He is the vessel of Libyan identity. Now that changed because he was volatile. It could be leader of the Africans, it could be leader of the Arabs. But I'm interested in my book in his Bedouin identity. And here he's got the African thing going on. And he became the bearer of, through his body, the traumas suffered by during Italian occupation, including the 40,000 Bedouin, at least, who perished in Italian concentration camps. And he also made himself often the bearer of history. There's a lot of interesting photos of him with robes that have photos sometimes printed onto the fabric, or sometimes he pins them of martyrs of whatever cause he's dealing with at the time. When he entered the land of the enemy, Italy, for the first time in 2009 with Berlusconi, he had pinned to his chest a picture of the resistance martyr Omar al-Mukhtar, who was hanged by fascists in 1931 and inspired him and many in the Arab world. But he had it pinned to his chest. So the body is the bearer of history. And Gaddafi only makes this more explicit by actually having, pinning things to himself. But they all do this. So Trump, one of the conclusions of my book, which again I'm still writing, is that Trump is, in all my public things I've said, one of the ways to interpret Trump, make him legible, is through this authoritarian playbook. And so he comes into this, through his public outpourings of emotion at rallies, his costume is his Brioni suit, but it's expressed through voice, through gesture, through body language. And when he says, I am your voice, he participates in this tradition. So this is a 2018 painting by John McNaughton, a pro-Trump supporter, called Respect the Flag, and the context for it is the crusade against the NFL players who protested brutality and were kneeling. So this is why he's in the stadium. But it's interesting, he's stricken and he's bereft, and he's clasping to his chest a tattered flag, which is, again, the country has been humiliated, right? And this is very polysemic. It happens to be here for the NFL, but this is a huge Trump theme that he's going to rescue and he's going to avenge the humiliations of the nation. And so he stares into space. He's feeling America's wounds as his own, and he's shouldering the burden of, righting this monstrous wrong. Now, of course, he has zero empathy as a person, as we know, so this is fantasy, but it's a propaganda that participates in this long, long tradition. Now, part of populism is this verbal frankness, right? They do the tough work, they take on the risks, like the Hitler picture, and they say what others will not say. And every single leader I'm studying, again, whether it's Gaddafi, whatever tradition they come from, they all have this fame of doing the tough verbal and bodily work. So Bolsonaro, the visual analog of this, so the body politics analog, is having this kind of false or somewhat transparency of the body. And so there's been a revival with Putin, most of all, of Mussolini's, I'm not showing Mussolini here, but his exhibitionism, right? And this is part of that. My body is available to you. So there's different traditions. Trump is not somebody, an Orbán, they're not taking their clothes off. But Bolsonaro is participating in this, and it's very interesting because he's a military man. As you all know, he just ordered them to commemorate the coup of the dictatorship. But by now, it's like the austerity of a Pinochet is he's not adopting that. He's going for the theatricality of the body. So here he is in his hospital bed, which Pinochet would never in a million years have, shown himself like this. But this participates in the attempted assassination during the campaign. And this is more recent, and he got pneumonia, but it's linked to the weakness of his body still recovering. So this is a very interesting kind of display of the body in this way. But it has to go with the strength, and so this is the other side of Bolsonaro, right? So they go together. Another strongman use of the body, though, is as the incarnation of threat. They weaponize their bodies, some of them. Now, Putin doesn't need to be so obvious because everyone knew he was, an agent. They advertise their personal capacity for violence or their proximity to violence, their willingness to order others to kill. And they do this on the way up during the campaign, many of them, which can seem counterintuitive, right? But it's very important that when they arrive in power, everyone is already terrified. Bolsonaro did it. Duterte is the most open, and here's a quote from Duterte during his 2015 presidential campaign. "I'm telling the Filipino people not to vote for me because it's going to be bloody." So, and the other virtue of this is that authoritarians tell us what they're going to do to us, but we don't listen. And they are who they are. And one thing one can say about them, including Trump, is that he was very clear who he was. He made it very clear. He told us. He's not showing us his tax returns, but he has told us of his intention to abuse us and to use violence and all of this. And in fact, in this tradition comes what was very mystifying to people, January 24th, 2016, emblazoned on my brain. I literally ran home to do an op-ed. He said, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, and I wouldn't lose any followers. So this comes within this tradition, but it is very a counterintuitive thing for someone running for president to do. Like, who in their right mind would do this? But he's not mad. There's a method and a history of such things. So he was telling us that he is allying with violence, that he could himself do violence, and that he considers himself above the law. That's the lasting thing. So to close, today's leaders depend more on such tactics to motivate people to fulfill their goals, given that the use of mass force on civilians is more unpopular and less common. So they make examples of people, and Putin is famous for this. So they're skilled at signaling their approval of any violence that their followers might be inclined, if they're in a democracy especially, to inflict on their enemies. Trump did this repeatedly during the campaign, mimicking shooting Clinton and saying maybe Second Amendment, people can take care of her. But this is also part of their foreign relations, where they support each other and they signal that extraterritorial, tragically with Jamal Khashoggi, which Trump has refused to denounce, that any kind of violence that their partner does, that their friend does, meaning other strongmen, they will be okay with it. So here we have, not long after the Russian reporter Anna Politkovskaya was murdered, Trump and, because it's very similar. Berlusconi and Putin had, unfortunately for us, a relationship very similar to Trump and Putin's. And they had a conference together in 2006, and this reporter asked Putin about his alleged mistress. And Putin got very angry. You can see the clip. It's hard to find nowadays because his body language is just getting very angry. And his good friend, lackey, Berlusconi, jumps in for him and mimics machine gunning the reporter, with the cameras rolling, of course. So this is another example, and again, Trump is in this tradition. So to close, we've paid way too little attention to this aspect of charismatic authority, this threat, because it's fundamental to understand how the strongman operates. He is tremendous in the sense of the word's Latin origins, tremens. His aim is to intimidate us into silence, but also to make us tremble with fear. So the cults of men like Putin and Berlusconi and Trump, they celebrate their machismo, but also their power to get away with murder, literally and figuratively. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. So Hideo Hand, his presentation is titled Bonapartist Leaders and the Imaginary People.
Thank you for the opportunity to say some things that stem from a book that I'm trying to finish with the provisional title, The Permanent Crisis of Democracy. The idea in the book is that actually there is no such thing as a democracy without a crisis. And one of the elements of that crisis is the intricate connection between democracy and the emergence of strongmen, populist leaders, over a longer period of time. And I want to draw the attention to the 19th century tradition of these strongmen, more in particular the tradition of Bonapartism. I think it is the analysis of Bonapartism as it emerges in the 19th century that might help us to understand what's going on here. And I will talk about it in 3 points. First, what was it according to people in the 19th century? Why did it emerge and how did it function? First of all, what was it? I think it was, first of all, a practice that emerged under Napoleon in the context of the way in which he tried to legitimate his rule, his leadership, by an appeal to the consent of the people. Napoleon held regular elections in 1800 and 1850, between 1800 and 1815. He organized referenda at various moments and also plebiscites in 1802 and 1804. Now, it is of course clear that those elections were generally rigged and unfair and all kinds of other ways seen as problematic from a democratic point of view. Yet the crucial point here is that elections performed an important function not to express the diversity of opinions that could of course be rigged, but to express unity, the unity between the leader and the people. Ma volonté est celle du peuple, that is the essence of what he wanted to express. As a concept, Bonapartism emerged immediately after the end of Napoleon's rule from 1815. There are all kinds of people who start to talk about Bonapartism. And the gist of those arguments is, as the historian of Bonapartism, Hazar Riesing, argues, a popular system of rule, governing in the interest of the people and deriving its legitimacy from their explicit support. And the most important document explaining and developing that idea is written by the nephew of Napoleon, Napoleon Louis Bonaparte, who published in 1839 Des idées napoléoniennes, title, Napoleonic ideas, which is first of all, of course, an eulogy of his uncle, who he describes as the l'exécuteur testamentaire de la Révolution. So the phrase is there, he purified the revolution, he seated firmly kings, and he ennobled the people. That was what Napoleon brought together all these different tendencies of the period before. But moreover, he exemplified a form of providential leadership. He called him a messiah of new ideas, who then at a moment of social dissolution identified with the sentiments of the people and guided them boldly towards the end which they desired to reach. I will quote from the English translation of this book. He did that by responding to the people because he shared the fiber of the people. He feels as the people feels. That's the all expressions that are used there. There's a union of sentiment, of instinct and of will that creates the power of the emperor. And an important and intriguing formulation is there that he also said that the interaction between leader and people is an interaction representing the skill of the workman, who is knowing how to avail himself of the materials he has at hand. So the people is a mass that needs to be kneaded into a certain form. It's the leader creating the people in its interaction. Now the pamphlet is interesting as it is. There are all kinds of other elements into it, which I will not go into. But it was also, of course, a political tool. It was a claim to power. He wanted to play an important role in French politics, and actually he did two failed attempts at a coup d'etat. The second coup in 1840 was actually seen as a failure beyond comedy. The term comedy is interesting here. It's a journal de débat that argues that. And the conclusion of that comment is, one shouldn't kill fools, but they should be locked up. So he was seen as an idiot, yet a successful idiot, because he was elected first as the president and then as a president for life, and in the end he became the emperor. It was even at that moment that Victor Hugo called him Napoleon le Petit, and quoting from that pamphlet, a vulgar, childish, theatrical and vain character. He was not an idiot, but he was a crook and a fraud. It is someone who doesn't speak but only lies. It sounds familiar. In terms of the nature, I think there's a sketch of what it actually is. The explanation of why this emerges is also something that's immediately reflected upon in this context of the Emperor Napoleon, namely in the document in the book by Karl Marx, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And I think the crucial explanation that Karl Marx presents there is that this kind of leadership emerges at a moment of what he calls sentiments and illusions that people carry with them as a result of their tradition and upbringing, and as a result of that they imagine that they form the real motives and the starting points of their activities, which in fact are quite different. The interesting thing of this whole book is that it is far removed from a determinist, materialistic understanding of history. This is Marx at his best, I would say, having a very clear idea of the political logic that plays a role here. And actually the main part of the book is an argument about the delusions of the various social classes, about what they're actually involved in. Delusions about the alliances that are actually separation, struggles, whose first law is indecision, wild, inane agitation in the name of tranquility, most of them preaching of tranquility in the name of revolution, passion without truth, truth without passion, heroes without heroic deeds, history without events. So this is a time of general confusion of what is actually going on. And it is in this condition that the populist Bonapartist leader is able to present himself as creating order in that kind of confusion of what actually social relations are about. Now the third point then is, how does he do that? According to Marx, there are two main elements there. The first is the evocation of the past, and it is there that we see all these famous quotes. It is the tradition of all dead generations that weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. It's the evocation of the past. It is what Marx described as world historical necromancy. It is the evocation of ghosts. So there's this notion of ghosts and spirits, spectral analysis, you might call it, is a crucial element. First of all, of course, the ghost of Napoleon. That's the first ghost that is evoked. But after that, it is also the ghost of the French Revolution. Now, Marx argues that that's not something special or new. And actually, the French Revolution itself reenacted another past, namely that of the Roman Republic. Yet that resurrection of the dead, Marx argued, serve the purpose of glorifying new struggles, not of parodying, how do you pronounce that? Parodying the olds. And there he makes this distinction between revolutionary evocations of the past and Bonapartist reactionary evocations of the past. There's no future perspective, it's only the spirit's ghost-like imagination of the past that is central here. It is here that it is the famous quote, the famous opening sentence of the pamphlet refers to it. Hegel remarks somewhere that all facts and personages of great importance in world history occur as it were twice, but he forgot to add the first time as strategy, the second as farce. So that's the evocation of the past in a ghost-like form is an important element. And then a second element of how he did that is, and Marx describes that in some detail because he was present at that time. It's a piece of journalism, you might say. Louis Bonaparte did that by touring the country accompanied by members of the Society of 10 December. So it's a group of people who, together with Napoleon, toured the country to promote his case. And he describes that group of people, and it's interesting the description that he has there. It's an untidy assembly, he argues, of pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, macaroons, brothel peoples, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, beggars. In short, the whole indefinite, disintegrated mass which the French term la bohème. And it's interesting to see what Marx is actually describing here. If you want to compare it to contemporary phenomena, it is the community of the literati, maybe. It is an alternative theater of political representation that challenges more parliamentary forms of representation that is here mobilized as an arena of new representations. So to conclude, Bonapartist rule is the result of a crisis of order, of a confusion about actual relations. And you could say in the 19th century that was first of all a crisis of the society of orders, of ranking orders. It was also confusion about what a class society actually was. But if you have try to find a contemporary notion here, it is the crisis of party, of party politics that I think is an important element here. So it is, I think, it is a result of an actual crisis. Yet at the same time, it can only be sustained and perpetuated by keeping that crisis going. And it is from that perspective, the perspective of what might be called the problem of routinization of charisma, as Weber also presented, that populist leaders have to do both. They have to present themselves as the saviors, who offer a resolution of a crisis, but they at the same time have to perpetuate that crisis indefinitely because that is the foundation of their claim to fame. And it is, I think, in that context that you see the constant reference to some kind of war to be fought in some theater. Emperor Napoleon fought all kinds of very unsuccessful wars, and in the end brought his downfall when he tried to start a war against Russia. But there are all kinds of other wars: the war on communism, the war on terrorism, the war against migrants, and many other barbarians at the gate that in some way need to be fought with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. So to conclude, or to start another phase, Valentina Ismailova will present on militarizing the saints, Putin and the Russian Orthodoxy.
Thank you. Thank you for including me in